What happens when a man insults Barack Obama on a city bus? What unfolds next leaves everyone speechless. The bus was bustling with its usual hum of activity, people scrolling through their phones, chatting with one another, or simply staring out the windows. Among them sat James, a man in his mid-40s, slouched against the seat near the back of the bus. His unkempt hair and irritated expression spoke of a man who had seen too many bad days in a row. Life had been cruel lately, and James had grown bitter, angry at everything and everyone, blaming the world for his misfortunes. As the bus pulled into the next stop, the doors opened with a familiar hiss. A tall, calm figure stepped inside, dressed in a simple blazer and jeans. Heads turned, and murmurs rippled through the passengers. It was Barack Obama. Yes, the former President of the United States had just boarded the city bus, carrying himself with a quiet grace that made people instinctively straighten up in their seats. Most people exchanged shocked glances, whispering to one another. Why was he here? What was he doing on this bus? Some passengers smiled nervously, too awestruck to say a word. James, however, was unimpressed. In fact, he scoffed loudly, earning a few startled looks from the passengers nearby. "Well, look who it is," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for people around him to hear. "Mr. Hope and Change himself. Guess the private jets are all booked, huh?" His words dripped with sarcasm, and a few passengers shifted uncomfortably, clearly embarrassed by the scene he was creating. Obama, now seated a few rows away, heard the comment but didn't react immediately. Instead, he offered a polite smile to the elderly woman beside him and calmly folded his hands in his lap, his composure unshaken. But James wasn't done. Feeling emboldened by the silence, he leaned forward and raised his voice. "You know, people like you are the reason folks like me can't get ahead. All your promises, nothing but hot air." The tension on the bus was palpable now. Some passengers avoided looking at James, pretending to focus on their phones, while others watched in shocked silence. One young woman whispered to her friend, "Is he seriously yelling at Barack Obama right now?" But what happened next silenced everyone on the bus. Obama turned his head slightly, his calm eyes meeting James's glare. The bus fell into an eerie silence as everyone waited to see how he would respond. Instead of anger or frustration, Obama simply smiled, a small, understanding smile that seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he said gently, his voice steady and sincere. "What's on your mind? Maybe we can talk about it." James blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness in his tone. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure of how to respond. But the bitterness inside him wouldn't let go so easily. He laughed harshly and leaned back in his seat. "Talk about it? What's the point? You wouldn't get it. People like me, we're just numbers to people like you. You say all the right things, but nothing ever changes." The other passengers watched in stunned silence, their eyes darting between James and Obama. A young man in a suit sitting nearby looked like he was about to intervene, but Obama held up a hand to stop him, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I hear you," he said, his voice still soft but firm. "And I know it can feel that way sometimes. But change isn't always easy, and it doesn't always happen the way we hope. Still, every voice matters, including yours." James scoffed again, though this time it lacked the same venom. "Yeah, sure. Easy for you to say when you've got everything handed to you. You've probably never had to struggle a day in your life." At this, Obama leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "You know, James," he said, his tone a little more personal now, "I grew up with a single mom who sometimes struggled to make ends meet. I've been in rooms where people didn't take me seriously because of where I came from, or because of how I looked. I've faced challenges, just like you have. And I know what it feels like to think no one's listening." James stared at him, his usual confidence faltering. He hadn't expected this, a genuine response, one that didn't dismiss his anger or shut him down. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The other passengers were silent, hanging on every word, the atmosphere tense yet oddly hopeful. "But here's the thing," Obama continued, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "No matter how tough things get, giving up or giving in to bitterness doesn't help. It's what we do with that frustration that matters. Do we use it to tear each other down, or do we try to build something better?" James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fists clenched. "Easy words," he muttered, though his voice had lost its earlier edge. "Maybe," Obama said with a small nod. "But they're true. And you don't have to take my word for it. Look around you. There are people who care, who are trying to make things better, even if it's just in small ways. Maybe you've been one of those people before, too." James glanced at the floor, avoiding Obama's gaze. He didn't have a quick comeback this time. The bus rolled on in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound as Obama leaned back in his seat, giving James space to process his words. The other passengers exchanged quiet glances, some nodding subtly, as if they, too, had been moved by what they'd just heard. The bus rolled to the next stop, but no one moved. The passengers were too captivated by the unexpected interaction unfolding before them. James stared out the window, his jaw tight, his mind racing with thoughts he wasn't ready to confront. Obama, on the other hand, sat calmly, his presence unshaken, as if he was waiting for James to respond, or maybe just letting his words sink in. After what felt like an eternity, James finally turned his head, his expression a mix of frustration and confusion. "Why are you even talking to me? What do you get out of this? You could have just ignored me like everyone else does." Obama's eyes softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "Because I believe every conversation matters," he said simply. "And sometimes, the people who seem the angriest are the ones who need to be heard the most. Maybe I don't know everything you're going through, James, but I do know that bitterness only keeps us stuck. You're not alone in this, even if it feels that way." James opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself. His throat tightened, and he clenched his fists, the weight of years of struggle, disappointment, and anger bubbling to the surface. "You make it sound so easy," he muttered, his voice cracking slightly. "But it's not. You have no idea how hard it is to keep going when everything feels like it's falling apart." Obama nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "You're right. It's not easy, and I'm not here to pretend it is. But what I do know is that you're stronger than you think. The fact that you're still here, still fighting, even if it's just to make it through the day, that says a lot about you, James. And it's not something to take lightly." James swallowed hard, his defenses crumbling. He glanced around the bus, noticing for the first time how many people were watching him, not with judgment, but with quiet empathy. A young woman a few seats away offered him a small, encouraging smile, and an older man nodded as if to say, "I've been there too." For a moment, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Connection. "I don't know," James mumbled, shaking his head. "It just feels like no one cares. Like nothing ever changes, no matter how hard you try." "I get that," Obama said gently. "But change doesn't always happen the way we expect it to. Sometimes it's slow, and sometimes it feels invisible. But every small step counts. Every time you choose to keep going, even when it's hard, you're making a difference, whether you see it or not." James let out a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his anger had finally started to lift. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, with kindness, with respect, with hope. It was unsettling and comforting all at once. The bus began to slow down again, the next stop approaching. James glanced at Obama, his expression softer now, almost hesitant. "Do you really believe that? That things can get better?" Obama's smile returned, warm and reassuring. "I do. And I think, deep down, you do too. Otherwise, you wouldn't still be here." The bus came to a stop, and a few passengers got up to leave, murmuring their thanks to the driver. As the doors opened, James sat quietly, staring at the floor, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions he wasn't sure how to handle. The bus driver, who had been listening to the entire exchange from his seat, turned back and gave James a firm nod. "He's right, you know," the driver said, his voice gruff but kind. "It's never too late to turn things around." James looked up, his eyes meeting Obama's once more. For the first time in what felt like forever, he managed a small, tentative smile. "Thanks," he said quietly, the word carrying a weight that spoke volumes. Obama stood as the bus reached his stop, adjusting his jacket and giving James one last encouraging look. "Take care of yourself, James. And don't forget, you matter." With that, he stepped off the bus, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy yet hopeful. James watched him walk away, his mind still processing everything that had just happened. The bus doors closed, and it pulled back onto the street, the passengers buzzing with quiet conversations about what they'd witnessed. As the city blurred past the windows, James sat back in his seat, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, there was a glimmer of hope after all. As the bus moved along its route, James stayed in his seat, staring out of the window. The city lights flickered by, and his reflection stared back at him. A man who had been carrying so much anger for so long, it had become second nature. But now, something was different. Obama's words echoed in his mind, cutting through the fog of bitterness that had clouded his thoughts for years. "You're stronger than you think." Could that really be true? Was there still a chance for things to change? A soft voice broke his thoughts. "Excuse me." James turned to see the young woman who had smiled at him earlier, now sitting in the seat across from him. She had a kind face, her brown eyes full of sincerity. "I just wanted to say, what he said back there, he was right. You do matter." James blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially not after he had made such a scene. Thanks," he muttered, his voice awkward but genuine. He wasn't sure what else to say. The woman nodded, her smile unwavering, before returning to her seat. Her words stayed with him, though. She hadn't judged him. She hadn't dismissed him. She had just seen him. The bus stopped again, and an elderly man with a cane hobbled on, his movements slow and deliberate. James instinctively moved to offer his seat, and the man nodded in appreciation, settling in with a sigh. It was a small thing, but as James sat back down in a different seat, he realized how much it mattered. The interaction, though brief, made him feel human. It was a reminder that kindness didn't have to be grand to make an impact. As the ride continued, James found himself thinking about his life, his struggles, his choices, his regrets. He had spent so much time being angry, blaming the world for his problems, that he hadn't stopped to consider what he could do differently. Maybe Obama was right. Maybe holding on to that anger was only keeping him stuck. But could he really let it go? Could he even begin to try? The bus turned a corner, and James spotted a familiar diner through the window. It was the kind of place he used to go to with his friends back in the day, before life got so complicated. He hadn't set foot in there for years, not since he had started isolating himself from everyone he cared about. A pang of nostalgia hit him, and for a moment he considered getting off at the next stop and walking back. Maybe it was time to reconnect with old friends, to see if any bridges could still be mended. But he hesitated. The fear of rejection, of facing the consequences of his actions, loomed large. What if it was too late? What if the damage was already done? The bus rolled on, and the diner disappeared from view, leaving James with a sinking feeling in his chest. Yet, even as doubt crept in, a small voice inside him whispered, "It's not too late." At the next stop, a mother and her young son boarded the bus, the boy clutching a tattered book in his hands. He was talking excitedly about something, his voice full of wonder. "And then the hero saves everyone, Mom. He doesn't give up, even when it's really hard." The mother smiled patiently, guiding him to a seat near the front. James couldn't help but overhear their conversation, and the boy's words struck a chord. He had once been that kid, full of dreams and hope. When had he lost that part of himself? The bus began to empty out as it neared the end of its route, and James realized his stop was coming up. He gathered his thoughts, unsure of what to do next, but feeling a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: possibility. As he stepped off the bus and into the crisp evening air, he paused for a moment, glancing back at the vehicle as it pulled away. He didn't know where this new path might lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to take the first step. The city lights twinkled above him as he started walking, the sound of his footsteps mingling with a distant hum of traffic. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Obama's voice lingered, a steady reminder that change, no matter how small, was always within reach. James didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let the past define him anymore. Tonight, he would try. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. James walked aimlessly through the streets, his hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets. The cool night air nipped at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts, fragments of memories, snippets of conversations, and the lingering impact of what had just happened on the bus. He couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was different. For years, he had carried his anger like armor, a shield to protect himself from the disappointments and frustrations of life. But now, that armor felt heavy, suffocating even. He wasn't sure he wanted to carry it anymore. As he turned the corner, he found himself standing in front of the diner he had seen earlier. The warm glow of the neon sign reflected off the windows, and inside, he could see people laughing, eating, and talking. It was such a simple, ordinary scene, but it pulled at something deep inside him. He hesitated, his feet rooted to the spot. What if he went in? What if he didn't? He felt like he was standing at a crossroads, and for the first time in years, he realized the choice was his to make. Taking a deep breath, James pushed the door open. The smell of coffee and fried food hit him instantly, a nostalgic blend that brought back memories of late nights with friends and early morning breakfasts after long shifts. The place hadn't changed much. Same red booths, same checkerboard floor, same old jukebox in the corner. It was like stepping back in time. He slid into a booth near the back, away from the crowd, and picked up a menu. Not because he needed to order, but because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. As he scanned the list of items, a waitress approached, her notepad in hand and a friendly smile on her face. "What can I get you tonight?" she asked. James looked up, startled by the warmth in her voice. For a moment, he fumbled for words. Just coffee, I guess," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. The waitress nodded, jotting it down. "Coming right up," she said before walking away. As he waited, James glanced around the diner, his eyes landing on a group of friends in a nearby booth. They were laughing loudly, their energy infectious. One of them was showing off some ridiculous dance move, and the others were cheering him on. James couldn't help but smile a little. It reminded him of how things used to be, back when he wasn't so weighed down by everything. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting the steaming mug down in front of him. "Anything else?" she asked, her eyes kind and genuine. James shook his head. "No, this is fine. Thanks." She gave him a small nod before moving on to the next table, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He stared into the dark liquid, the steam curling up in delicate wisps. He thought about the bus ride, about Obama's words, about the young woman who had told him he mattered. It all felt so surreal, like a dream he was afraid to wake up from. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, and it was up to him what he did with it. Before he could talk himself out of it, James pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Most of the names felt like ghosts, people he hadn't spoken to in years, people he'd pushed away or lost touch with. His thumb hovered over one name in particular, Mike. They used to be best friends, inseparable even, but things had fallen apart after a stupid argument neither of them could remember the details of any more. James hesitated, his heart pounding. What if Mike didn't pick up? What if he didn't want to talk? The thought was terrifying, but another voice in his head reminded him of what Obama had said. Every small step counts. And this was a step. He pressed the call button, his hands shaking slightly as he held the phone to his ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and for a moment James thought it would go to voicemail. But then a familiar voice answered, hesitant but unmistakable. "James? Is that you?" James felt a lump rise in his throat. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's me." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment James thought Mike might hang up. But then he spoke again, his tone softer this time. "It's been a while. How've you been?" James let out a shaky breath, a mix of relief and nervousness flooding through him. "Not great, if I'm being honest," he admitted. "But I'm trying to figure things out. I thought maybe we could catch up sometime, if you're up for it." Another pause, but this time it felt different, less tense, more thoughtful. "Yeah," Mike said finally. "I think I'd like that." James felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine one he'd had in a long time. "Thanks, Mike. I mean it." They talked for a few more minutes, making tentative plans to meet up later in the week. When James finally hung up, he felt lighter, like a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for the first time in years he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better.